Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. It's back to school week, and we're pleased to host two journalists whose beats cover the world of higher education. In the second half of our show, we'll talk to Robbie Suave, a not too long ago graduate of the University of Michigan, currently the staff editor at Reason.com. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Greg Piper, associate editor of The College Fix, one of my favorite online publications. Greg, welcome to the show. Thanks for having me. Greg, I asked both you and Robbie Suave from Reason to come on the show this week to bring us up to date on the contemporary college scene. You know, for people who are many years out of school or don't have kids in college, the current environment might be difficult to recognize. I'd like to start with the war on conventional ideas about gender and sexuality. Bring us up to date on the gender liberation movement.
What you call the gender liberation movement is pretty much an attempt by sometimes administrators, sometimes professors, sometimes student activists to try to get rid of what we see as traditional gender lines. And a lot of it is trying to change language. Even regular pronouns are being called sexist right now. There are entirely new terms like je and jure, which are seen as being more respectful to people who don't identify, let's say, as male or female. There are actually suggestions now that before professors or students go into a meeting with some new people, they ask them, what pronoun do you prefer? They don't want there to be any assumption that I see you the way that just I'm perceiving you, but I want you to be able to define yourself ahead of time. And that gets a little bit laborious if everybody you meet, you are constantly asking them,
you need a database.
How do you identify? You know, you look like a normal guy, but for all I know, you may identify as a cheeky woman, maybe not even a white person. It sounds a little bit silly, but kind of the repetition of this, of saying you should be doing this, there's concern that this is going to be something people could be punished for, that there could be backlash against them, that they could be accused of sexism or insensitivity, and it could backfire on their career or on their grades.
Well, you know, for listeners who are behind the times, how many genders are recognized on campuses or elsewhere, and what are they called? Is there a definitive list somewhere?
I'm not aware of a definitive list. What we know recently is that the University of California is giving students 6 options for gender identities when they actually apply for any of the campuses there. Mm-hmm. And so they can call themselves male, female, trans man, trans female, trans woman, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, or this catch-all term, different identity. And they'll ask you what sex were you assigned at birth. And so they're trying to give students an opportunity to be comfortable right up front and saying, I get to define who I am. I'm not going to feel pigeonholed by only 2 options on a form.
And I understand that Facebook has a list of genders even longer.
Yeah, they have been really, I guess you could say, forward on this and trying to get ahead of concern by users that they're trying to put people in a category they don't want to be in. And of course, Facebook often deals with angry user populations, so the sooner they can get ahead of the outrage and try to satisfy people before they form an angry mob and start complaining, and before there's news stories all about it. It's an easy thing just to provide all these options. It's not gonna hurt them. They have no dog in the fight.
So is there a safe list of gender pronouns that we can refer to?
I think the safe list right now is probably what came out of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, I think just in the past week. Their Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which sounds kind of terrifying to me, actually published a list that they're trying to get professors to use when they're actually doing student introductions. And it lays out all of the terms that many people are unfamiliar with, like the ones that start with X's instead of H's or she or anything like that. Je, jure, jures, or maybe jeer. I've never heard these things said out loud. I really only read them.
Yeah, XYR is kind of a tough one.
It's a weird one. I think a lot of people, when they see these things, it's going to be kind of like the artist formerly known as Prince. They're just not going to ever say it out loud. They're going to kind of suggest to a person who's given them the stink eye, what should I be calling you? What pronoun? So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for awkwardness, because people, probably more than anything else, don't want to be accused of insensitivity. They don't want to be seen as stepping on someone. They want to be respectful, but at the same time, when you really go to those lengths, you kind of invite more criticism. Like you give them an opening and they decide that they can get more out of you. And I think it emboldens a lot of these people who want to get rid of gender distinctions and foster the idea that you create who you are in every possible sense of the word, even something biological about you.
So isn't getting rid of gender distinctions exactly opposite to creating more gender distinctions?
I mean, I think that's the irony there, is that the more that you talk about gender as a social construct, that something that just societies have always created to enforce power structures, you have a growing list of terms that you're supposed to kind of keep updated. I mean, you almost need like a checklist that you carry around with you, like a task list on your phone, just so you know each day and week what new terms have been added. The simple way to do this now, especially with sexual orientation, is simply to put an asterisk at the end. And the asterisk means whatever else we think might happen in the future, because we kind of recognize ourselves, this list is getting unwieldy. I think right now, the formal one that you see a lot of schools using is LGBTQIA asterisk.
Asterisk?
Yeah.
It's like a wild card.
It's pretty much a wild card. It's the same with the word trans, because trans is this new category that is not simply people who have actually formally gone through a sex change, but people who simply don't identify with their birth.
Wow.
Instead of seeing the word transgender, which is seen in some quarters as being a little offensive as well, you'll just see trans asterisk. And trans asterisk is a way of saying you identify as trans, but you have your own spin on it. We're not going to try to tell you what that is. We're not even going to say that gender is involved there.
Well, there you go.
I mean, there's almost this hostility to the idea that we have gender at all. And the front lines of this are really on college campuses.
How are single-sex colleges like Wellesley and Smith dealing with these new notions of gender? Are they going to go co-ed, or do they have to make up new rules?
They're going different directions. Some of these, I think maybe Columbia is one of them, have basically said that as long as you don't, I think, identify as a man when you enroll, when you're actually applying, then they're okay with it. If you transition while you're there, I think at most of these women's colleges now, you can stay there. So it's kind of like you apply as whatever gender people think you are, and then you go through transition. The school really can't do anything because they have this in their policy that they grandfather people in when they do it during school. But even that's getting to be perhaps untenable, because there's all this pressure on these schools to really accept people based on whatever identity they are. And they may say, I don't identify really as anything. You have some old school feminists who are fighting back on this and who are saying these schools are really founded to give women their own place, and there still is a place for these schools, a place where women really feel safe and where their identities aren't kind of crowded out by whatever newfangled identities that we come up with. Not that there's anything wrong with those, but it's just not the place for these schools to be embracing every new identity.
But under the current rules, couldn't a bunch of adventurous guys apply to Wellesley and just claim that they identify as female, smile, smirk, and go to school there?
That's exactly it. Yeah, I think there was actually a comedy about this 10 years ago that seemed kind of patently ridiculous on its face. Now it seems completely plausible, where you would really probably spark a lawsuit about this if these students applied and said, we are following your rules exactly here. And then the school would go to court, and I'm guessing there would probably be some kind of settlement. They'd be able to, let's say, continue their education. But I've kind of wondered this myself. Why don't we see more people who will say, I identify as this identity, and then really do nothing else to kind of show that they embrace it? I mean, not everybody's going to be Caitlyn Jenner here, where they decide to go for kind of the pinup doll look.
Right.
Why aren't there more men simply saying, I identify as a woman, and keeping the beard and the facial hair, and
let me in.
Yeah, and saying, you have no right under your own policy. This is how I identify. You haven't given me any requirements that I have to follow, let's say, biologically, or changing my voice or anything like that. So I think it'd be a fascinating legal battle if it came on to that.
So, Greg, how do you see this playing out in the years ahead?
I think you're going to see a lot of schools playing it safe, making small policy changes kind of around the edges until it looks like they perhaps have a lawsuit on their hands. Let's say maybe their state attorney general comes in and says, this is a Title IX issue, or this is a matter of protected identities. And I think there's some federal guidance also from the Justice Department in the Obama administration that is telling schools they need to recognize different identities. So I think a lot of this isn't going to necessarily be driven by schools kind of doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They are living in fear right now that they are going to be sued, that they're going to be under investigation. I would not want to be an administrator these days, because they are so full of directives pulling them in every different direction. And they could have federal funding on the line. They could just simply have terrible headlines for a year, like UVA last year.
Yeah, regulators to the right of me, lawyers to the left of me. You know, where do you go now?
Exactly. That's it.
So, Greg, looking at the wider drive for diversity and inclusion on college campuses, something called microaggressions are becoming the new prescribed behavior, kind of taking the place of outright racism, which has long been on decline. What is the theory of microaggressions, and where did it come from?
The theory of microaggressions goes back probably 25 years by now. I think it's late 80s, early 90s. It was stuff that was kind of floating under the surface for a long time. Really stuff you'd only see in academic journals and critical race theorists and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll have scholars who study race, and there are other ways to do microaggressions, but it's mostly around racial identity, ethnic identity. And so they came up with these conditions that people can theoretically get upset about. A lot of it has to do with people assuming because you aren't white that you aren't necessarily from America, or that your identity is primarily not American. So if you walk up to a person, you're meeting them for the first time, they're of some Asian background, you can tell. You can say, no, where are you really from? There's actually a list of this. I believe the University of California had a full list of this that they got in a little hot water for, because it looked like they were trying to tell people to avoid entire groups of phrases.
So this is a banned language list?
It looks an awful lot like a banned language list. A lot of this hasn't necessarily gone through a full adjudication process where you could say that these schools actually have been recognized to have this authority to ban language. A lot of what they're doing is trying to shape how people talk to each other through nudging, especially to faculty who are going to be dealing with students who are probably more sensitive than they're used to from previous generations. And so they will tell them, here are qualities to make sure that you don't offend your students accidentally. Here are phrases that you've probably heard before that are probably going to get bad reactions from students if you throw them out. So we just want, for your own sake, we don't want any problems to happen in the classroom. We want you to be speaking in this appropriate way, because students are otherwise going to complain, and that's going to be bad for all of us if students make a mistake about this.
I mean, some of it is incomprehensible. At UCLA, apparently professors are being instructed not to say America is the land of opportunity. Why is that microaggressive?
It contributes to this idea that America, I guess you could say, is blameless. This kind of American exceptionalism that has been an undercurrent in this country, and nobody says it's without its flaws or its sins. But simply saying that America has good qualities is becoming something that can get you in trouble right now. We don't want to have any discussion of America that does not put first and foremost its history with slavery, with running over Native peoples, with oppressing women or immigrant populations. And so saying that America is a land of opportunity in and of itself, without kind of throwing all the baggage on top of it, is simply seen as something that is offensive to students who have this entire bad history of America on their brains when they come in. And it's a way of kind of saying it's denying their own lived experience. Let's say they've dealt with racism in their youth, or they've dealt with other normative attitudes that they feel oppress them.
So are colleges training American students in self-loathing and self-censorship?
You could make a pretty good argument that they are. I would say that it's not primarily or always the faculty who are doing this. I think a lot of this is administrators who worry that they're going to look bad unless they pretty much respond right away to all this activism from students that they want to have no good material about America. They only want to hear bad things, and they only want their own views and their own kind of small bubble affirmed. You see faculty fighting against this a little bit more because there is still some concern for academic freedom in the academy. It hasn't been completely obliterated yet under all these various theories that have just come in the past few decades. And so I think there's actually a really good case to be made that the faculty should be brought in more here as kind of a bulwark against these movements, because they still are in a position of authority. They can be punished more easily than ever. That's the problem. And really have their administration come down on them for something as simple as trying to share different perspectives in class. That seems to be something that students today are just not used to, that they have to deal with really offensive ideas that they haven't had to deal with.
Well, diversity is important except in ideas. That seems to be the case on campus these days. And on that point, apparently there are now professors that are either volunteering or being forced to put trigger warnings in front of giving things like lectures on Shakespeare.
Yeah, Shakespeare is a really odd one because he's a standard part of most of these literature classes. You could say the foundation, really, of English literature classes. But because he's a white European male and he dealt with the issues of his day, including sex and power and murder and all of these things, but these are uncomfortable ideas for students. And if you're going to teach Shakespeare, you need to let them know right away that they're going to be dealing with something that's not a Disney cartoon. which seems like an odd thing for a group of students who have probably been watching much worse things, R-rated movies and, internet porn and all of that. But for whatever reason, reading words that are 500 years old is something that at least administrators and student activists think is just not appropriate without an entire disclaimer attached to it.
So, Greg, I work as an alumni volunteer with students from my own alma mater, and the number of deans and administrators concerned with monitoring and directing student life and language and behavior seem to have exploded. What's driving all this?
You can blame some of it on federal mandates. There's a lot of regulation that's coming out of the Department of Education. This is something actually that Vanderbilt brought up in testimony this year before Congress. They came up actually with a number figure of how much all this regulation cost them a year. They pegged it at, I think, an extra $13,000. And while that statistic has been a little controversial.
Per student?
What they said was the amount that we pay to cover regulation would be equivalent to an extra $13,000 in tuition per student a year. Now, that figure has a lot of context under it, and they've backed away from it a little bit, but there is still this growing recognition, especially among administrators, that we deal with a lot of overlapping regulation, things that take up too much of our time, that really have nothing to do with student learning. And it's something that we'd like to pare down if possible. They may get an assist from Congress this year. The reauthorization of the Higher Education Act is on the docket. And so they're hoping to get a little bit of regulatory relief there. But because there are so many of these mandates coming out still, especially from the Office for Civil Rights, which prosecutes a lot of these disciplinary proceedings, they pretty much feel like they have to just keep hiring new staff. You'll see this actually in their press releases when they respond to a controversy, oftentimes involving sexual violence of some kind.
They hire more people.
They hire more people. They're paying them salaries that oftentimes are higher than any elected official in the state. You could be a Title IX coordinator who heads up these efforts for a state university, even a private university, and be making not just six figures, but possibly $200,000 or more. These positions are so highly valued right now because they're the front line in these fights, mostly with federal government, but sometimes with their own states, over kind of these normal controversies of male-female relationships on campus, of students saying that they're part of a hostile educational environment, that they can't learn because they are experiencing sexism all the time, because their schools aren't taking seriously their allegations that they've been harassed or abused or had some kind of unpleasant interaction with a male student, let's say.
One thing that's very visible is that all these people are creating all sorts of courses that students are forced to take before they even start their classes, almost required indoctrination sessions.
Exactly. Orientation now is much more than just finding out what hall you're living in and kind of the general campus rules. You get an entire list of ways that you are prescribed to abide by. You learn how to actually consent to sexual relations. You may be watching a skit that tells you exactly how to do it. It probably looks like something really cheesy because they're laying it on really thick, so there's no ambiguity about that. And students are pretty much wondering, is the way that I have done this before simply wrong? Am I going to get in trouble if I don't follow this precise script here? Is there room for disagreement in what I do? And am I going to get in trouble if I forget to make this one motion or to ask for permission at this one time? And is this going to ruin the rest of my career? Is it going to be a black mark on my transcript that's going to follow me wherever I go?
Well, what's happened to the notion of free speech on campus? I mean, do students live in fear of being punished by professors or outed by classmates for speaking their minds about all this?
I think for particular views, especially if you were a religious conservative, this gets to be something that has to be weighing on you. We had an incident in the previous academic year at University of Wisconsin where a student was in a philosophy class and they came up on the subject of gay marriage. And this was a conservative religious student who wanted to talk about this and to share his perspective. And his instructor, who was only a graduate student, told him, no, you can't. It's going to make some people uncomfortable. And said, you're not allowed to share your perspective on this in class. We only know about this because the student recorded the conversation. And you have to imagine that this is happening more often in other places with students who would like to get some feedback on this and say, is this okay that my professor is not letting me share my views? but they have their grades on the line. They don't want to perhaps be in a adjudication fight where they are testifying against somebody, or this is going to drag them down. They're going to be subject to public scorn. So I have a feeling that there's a lot more of this under the surface right now. We're slowly hearing about it because occasionally it'll be printed on things like syllabi. So you take a picture of your syllabi, you post it online, and then it gets some more outrage there. But otherwise, it's just your word versus your professor, and you may very much feel like you're not in a position of any authority or power to be able to defend your right.
And it's not just religious students. I understand that UC Davis threatened criminal punishment for the Ayn Rand Club?
Yes, this is a really weird case. It's one that we've seen occasionally over the past year where an administration will try to clamp down on probably what it thinks are unpopular views, something that is going to reflect badly on the school, and they will say it's a trademark violation. and the only reason they have for that is that they'll put the school's name in their club, so you know where they are.
Yep.
So the Ayn Rand Society at UC Davis wanted to promote itself that way. Their Facebook page had the full name with the school in it. And the school said, no, you can't do that. They ended up losing their status as a student club. So there's some actual discrimination here, because they refuse to take off their geographical identifier. We are in Davis at the University of California. And the school changed its mind. We're not really sure why. They had gotten some criticism about it from the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which does a lot of great work in defending students for their speech when their school comes down on them. And so FIRE had intervened on this almost a year ago by now. And UC Davis, for whatever reason, I assume after talking to their lawyers, said, okay, we realize this isn't defensible. This is not a threat to our trademark at all. This is a non-commercial student group. It's not claiming that everybody at UC Davis, is an objectivist. And so the student club really had its activities cut short, was operating under this treatment that kind of put them almost outside as not even a part of the campus, simply because they have views that are probably offensive to a lot of people, and the school didn't want anybody confusing them. Who knows who's going to confuse? This is like the official house organ of UC Davis. But they were operating at a disadvantage for several months because they couldn't actually say where they were.
So, Greg, where do college journalists fit in all this? There seem to be an increasing number of schools not only censoring, but disciplining students who write for college newspapers who don't conform to the politically correct perspective.
There's a huge role for them right now. The good thing for them is that there's probably never been a better time to be a college journalist. You have ways to reach your audience right away. You can tweet at them. You can post on things that are outside of your own website. Let's say your website is actually paid for by the college or high school. You can reach your audience really in ways that you never could before. The problem for them is that when they report on all these things, there's simply a wider audience than there really has ever been before, and more opportunities for bad PR. It's global, yeah. You could be some little community college. There's actually one in Iowa that really put itself out there and got terrible PR because they had cracked down on their own little college newspaper for doing really ordinary things for a journalist, like putting a headshot of your subject along with a story about that subject. Nothing negative, but there's actually a dean at this school who said, you can't use my headshot or anyone else's headshot on campus unless you get my permission.
That's not journalism.
Yeah. So you have administrators who are oftentimes using fairly lame excuses, really, for micromanaging coverage and saying it's not a content issue. It's just I want you to follow kind of these general rules of how you report. But it kind of makes it impossible for these students. They decide there are some subjects that aren't worth covering because they know they're going to get blowback for it. They might have their funding threatened. They might have their transcript in trouble. You'll see sometimes administrators call in these students to have a little chat in the office and kind of give them this word that is not hostile on the surface, but you can kind of tell what direction they're going, to avoid certain subjects, to not use certain techniques like filing Freedom of Information Act requests, to demand really exorbitant fees to hand over information that they're legally required to, or that their own policies say they have to. And it makes it really difficult to do this kind of journalism unless you go independent. And this is something that we're seeing more of these papers do. They just decide they don't want the hassle anymore of having to follow the lead of administrators.
And they go off on their own.
Crowdfunding is getting to be a bigger deal right now. That community college in Iowa now has its own paper that is independently paid for. There's actually a larger effort that just started, I think, about a week ago by national journalism organizations that are doing actual on-campus training with student journalists on how to get around administrators, how to respond to them when they complain about something, what legal authorities they should be citing. So there's this entire other effort on the back end here with actual professionals who are coming in and helping these students, training them, the kind of things that their faculty advisors now are often not allowed to even do with them. This is a whole other story, faculty advisors being cowed by administrators. And so it's really outside help that's coming in to these students to help them know how to file requests, what authorities to cite, and how to set up their own papers outside of control so they can tell the stories that are interesting and of the public interest that their schools would rather not they do.
Greg, thanks for taking us through the looking glass onto today's college scene. It sure has changed from 40 years ago. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Bill.
That was Greg Piper from the College Fix here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, Robbie Suave, staff editor of Reason.com, digs into the heavy-handed way Title IX is being used to transform sexuality on campus. Stay tuned.